For Americans, this video of people desperately clinging on to a US plane as it departs Afghanistan has become one of the defining images of the end of a 2-decade war waged by 4 US presidents. But what did America's 20-year war look like to Afghans? Why did the government the US created in Afghanistan collapse in a matter of weeks? And what challenges do the people of Afghanistan face now that the Taliban has again taken power?
It absolutely impacts everything, the future of Afghanistan, the future of younger generation, and everything that we have built so far.
So how did Afghanistan get to where it is today?
The United States has been good at going into war, but has not been very good when it comes to coming out of those countries.
The US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, just weeks after the September 11th attacks, because the ruling Taliban was sheltering Al-Qaeda. In 2006, former President George W. Bush confidently declared,
"The days of the Taliban are over."
That, of course, was completely untrue, because what followed was the longest war in American history. The war only ended when the US negotiated its withdrawal with the same Taliban it had set out to destroy. Afghan people paid a heavy price for the 20-year war, with at least 47,000 civilians killed. But it's important to note that US involvement in Afghanistan actually started much earlier. In 1979, it was the Soviet Union that invaded Afghanistan to prop up a client government that was losing control of the country. During the 10-year war that followed, the Reagan administration supplied weapons to the Afghan resistance groups who fought against the Soviets, the Mujahideen. When the USSR pulled out of Afghanistan, they had little to show for their efforts.
And let there be no mistake about it. The withdrawal of Soviet forces is the key to resolving the Afghan crisis.
Not exactly. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. 3 years later, its client regime fell and rival Mujahideen groups began fighting amongst themselves. Many of those groups maintained an abusive regime over the civilian population, particularly women and girls. And the civil war took a heavy toll on Afghan civilians. The fighting ceased in 1996 when a group called, you guessed it, the Taliban captured Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, and declared the country an Islamic emirate. Many Afghans initially welcomed the Taliban, hoping they would bring some order after the brutal conflict between the Mujahideen. But it quickly became clear that the Taliban would also impose a harsh and abusive regime. They outright banned education for women and girls. They violently punished anybody who violated Taliban's rules based on their religious interpretations. And in one of the worst atrocities in Afghanistan's recent history, the Taliban massacred thousands of members of the Hazara ethnic and religious minority in Mazar-e-Sharif. It was during this period that the Taliban offered refuge to Al-Qaeda and its leaders, including Osama bin Laden. Keep in mind, bin Laden and his circle were part of a covert US-funded program in Afghanistan. But after Al-Qaeda organized the September 11th attacks, this happened.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The United States, when it went into Afghanistan, soon realized that Afghanistan is a large, vast, diverse country, and it cannot control purely on the basis of boots on the ground. So it needed help of local militias which could gain momentum and try and take those areas on behalf of the United States forces. Those were called the Northern Alliance.
In fact, it was the Northern Alliance who did the bulk of the fighting on the ground, working with US Special Forces to take Kabul. Once the capital was taken, the US created a new government that included a number of powerful warlords.
The system which now we see, which people call it as one of the most corrupt systems in the world, is endemically built upon the foundations of the warlords. It's a system which is corrupt. It is a system which has not provided them with the basic services, schools, hospitals, jobs, that people in Afghanistan feel that they needed.
Of course, the US-backed system did bring more liberal social order to some cities. Back in 2003, just over 7,000 women were university students in Afghanistan. By 2019, that number had grown to 49,000. But it's important to remember that the vast majority of Afghans, 74% to be exact, live in rural areas. And that's where the ongoing US war against the Taliban was actually taking place, causing death and worsening poverty and malnutrition. The US vastly undercounted civilian casualties caused by its strikes and has rarely held anyone accountable for them. This deepened anger towards the US and drove more Afghans to join insurgent groups affiliated with the Taliban.
Afghanistan in general was modernized after 2001. I would say that this modernization was focused on main cities. It also created some level of feelings, abandonment feelings among some of the young people in the areas that are excluded from enjoying these sort of opportunities. So it also created a conducive environment in rural areas for the Taliban to recruit young people.
US-backed militia groups, armed and funded by the CIA, have been implicated in the killing of civilians and other human rights abuses. Last year, the International Criminal Court attempted to open an investigation into war crimes committed on all sides in Afghanistan. But the US government has opposed this investigation under Trump and Biden.
The war has taken a real human toll in Afghanistan that the people of the United States do not seem to comprehend.
The American public saw little of the reality of what Afghans experienced during the 20-year presence of US troops in their country, since news from Afghanistan was often deliberately skewed.
The American public never saw the kind of problems that the Afghan people were facing with the so-called war on terror, whether it was night raids, whether it was drone strikes, whether it was children being killed, whether it was rights being usurped, whether it was inmates who were being tortured. Especially in the early days, those were the kind of things that were happening in Afghanistan, which were providing fertile ground for hardline groups to recruit and carry out their attacks because of so much violence which was being carried out in the name of the war on terror, in the name of going after Al-Qaeda. There was a lot of injustice.
We engaged in some of these enhanced interrogation techniques that I believe, and I think any fair-minded person would believe, were torture.
The US agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan in a deal signed between the Taliban and with the Trump administration in early 2020. But the Taliban didn't accept the legitimacy of the political system created by the US intervention and made it clear that it wanted to assert its power in Afghanistan.
أنه هذا الوضع نحن عندنا في الاتفاقية هناك ليس الوجود نحن ما نهجم على الإدارة كابول ليس هناك هدنة بيننا وبينهم. نحن هناك الهدنة بيننا وبين الأمريكان.
So, what happens now? Many Afghans fear the Taliban will go back to ruling the way they did in the 90s, with brutality and violent repression. But Taliban officials insist they plan on a different approach.
فعالیت لري او په چوکاټو د اصول په دننه کې به کار لري کار کولای شي په طبي تعلیمي او مختلفو برخو کې اړتیا ورته لرو د موږ ټولنې اړتیا هیڅ کوي دوی به موږ سره حضور ولري او فعالیت به وسی کولای البته په دې اړه چې نړیوال اندېښنې.
So there is realization amongst the Taliban as well that the Afghanistan that they left 20 years ago has changed. But what is that future Afghanistan going to look like? They're very clear that it is going to be under their brand of Sharia. They're very clear that it is going to have the laws which are going to be implemented according to the Quran and Sunnah, which they feel is the right way forward. But they realize that Afghanistan is different, Afghanistan has changed, and the rights and aspirations of Afghans, everyday Afghans on the streets, will have to be respected.
Thousands of Afghans, many of them skilled professionals, have already fled the country. Already, nearly 6 million Afghans have either become internally displaced or fled the country as refugees over the past few decades.
It is more than 40 years that Afghans are just suffering with these problems. Please hear the voice of Afghanistan. They are also humans.
The economic situation is also dire. Western powers, including the IMF, are trying to put pressure on the Taliban by freezing Afghanistan's assets. That's detrimental for Afghanistan, especially as 2/3 of the Afghan population is aged 24 or younger.
There are generations of Afghans who've been lost to this war, and that's why when you speak to the youth in Afghanistan, anybody who's got any prospects, any vision for the future would like to either leave the country or try and do something in the country which will take them in the direction which is away from politics and away from the violence.
Khurram says that peace activists had been trying to organize in anticipation of Taliban rule.
young female peace builders, they right now try to reach out to some of the conservative religious clerics and mullahs and people at the community level who can partner with those young women in order to make sure that women's rights would be fully incorporated into any Sharia law that would be implemented.
As the Taliban step into power and fear of both human rights violations and regional instability grows, young Afghans are trying to make sense of this multi-generational conflict.
Afghans themselves, they are frustrated, like all Americans who are frustrated from the war. But we are living in it, and nobody wants it to end more than us.